get the letter yet because
I'm gonna let the Faro know that it's gonna be streamed.
okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us, and welcome to the Inter-American Dialogue. On November 26th, I was watching CNN in Espanol, and I saw in the evening two candidates for the president of Honduras declare victory. The incumbent president, Juan Orlando Hernández, and his main opposition rival, Salvador Nasralla. And I sensed there was going to be a problem and some trouble. And of course, we have seen over the last 3 weeks the situation in Honduras, country that is experiencing a very serious governance political crisis. The second time in less than a decade that we've seen that in Honduras, with after the coup. Military coup in June of 2009. So once again, Honduras is on the agenda. I think many people here know the background and the suspicions that have been raised about the electoral process, and certainly a lot of questions about the credibility of the elections. Two monitors, the OAS and the European Union, were there on election day and noted irregularities. And on Sunday, after the official electoral commission announced that Juan Orlando Hernández had won the election by a small margin, the Secretary General of the Organization of American States rejected the official tally and has called for new elections. So that's where we are. This has posed a challenge, a test for the hemispheric community, and certainly for the United States government that has a long relationship with Honduras. We know we have the Alliance for Prosperity program to the Northern Triangle countries, and the government of Juan Orlando Hernández has been a partner, both the Obama administration and now with the Trump administration. So the question is, what happened on November 26th? How can we best understand and interpret that? And also, what is likely to happen now and what should happen now? And that's sort of the focus of our discussion this afternoon. And the idea, it really is to have an open, wide-ranging conversation and engage all of the people in this room, and I look around, I see many people with a lot of expertise and knowledge about Honduras and about other situations. So we look forward to your comments and contributions. Before introducing our panelists, who will really start us off with very brief opening comments, offering their insights and perspective on the situation, let me thank and acknowledge Michael Camilleri, who is the director of the Rule of Law program here at the Dialogue, and Ben Raderstoff, who's a program associate, for organizing and conceiving and organizing this meeting before the holidays, just to ventilate and talk about what I think is a very complex but important situation in Honduras. So thank you both. We are privileged to have with us, as I said, three excellent speakers to start us off with this conversation and dialogue this afternoon. Lisa Kubisky is the former diplomat who served as U.S. ambassador to Honduras in 2011 and 2014. She also was a deputy assistant secretary of state for international finance and development, which she served in Brazil as well as in the Dominican Republic. And we're thrilled to have Lisa with us this afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us. Carlos Dada, to my left, is a founder and director of El Faro, which has become a reference for independent and high-quality journalism in Central America since 1998, for 20 years, And Carlos has conducted lots of excellent reporting and investigation of corruption and violence. He's from El Salvador, but he has been focusing on Honduras lately. He has done a lot of excellent reporting on Honduras, and so he will give us an on-the-ground perspective of what's happening in the country. And finally, we're thrilled to have Juan Gonzalez with us, who is currently an associate vice president of the Cone Group here. He served in a variety of positions previously in the U.S. government, including the special advisor to Vice President Joe Biden, as well as the Deputy Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs, responsible for Central America and for the Caribbean. So we have an excellent group, and we have lots of terrific people here in the audience, and we want to hear from you as well. With that introduction, perhaps best to start with Carlos. Talk about how he sees the situation in Honduras from the ground, and also what you make of the recent call by the Secretary General, what you see as sort of the response by the OAS, by the United States to this very serious crisis. Carlos, thank you.
Gracias, Michael. Good afternoon to everybody. Thanks for the invitation to come and talk about this with such remarkable co-panelists here. I left Honduras like 10 days ago that I came here, and I feel already disconnected. It's an ongoing mess, but it's developing into different things every day. As we speak, there's huge turmoil in the streets of the biggest Honduran cities right now, particularly San Pedro Sula, El Progreso, and Tegucigalpa. There's serious confrontations between an enraged population and security forces. I heard just before coming here about confrontations in the outskirts of El Progreso, of buildings being burned in San Pedro Sula, and all the roads blocked in Tegucigalpa. Yesterday, they even blocked the airport, the access to the airport. So that's the situation on the ground, which is, of course, needless to say, a direct consequence of the political situation. So what we have now is a political crisis that nobody really knows how to solve, and we can get into details of that. That has provoked this social crisis, these serious confrontations on the streets. And there's no way to solve one without solving the other, unless you call repression a solution, which is not a desirable scenario. But while this is going on the streets, this is not going anywhere. Yesterday's declaration by the OAS, which was surprising to many of us, perhaps not to all of you, but to many of us it was, opened a new window. Just hours after the Supreme Electoral Tribunal in Honduras declared President Hernández, the incumbent, declared him the winner of the election. Had not the OAS given this declaration, we would be in a different scenario where we would just be thinking about how long the turmoil on the streets would last, because the president would be already in office, and that would be undeniable. The OAS statement is very surprising for its political consequences, not for where it derives from. The OAS observers mission clearly found so many irregularities in the process that, as we say in Central America, even the OAS is incapable of recognizing these results. So the same happened with the European Union. I think that both observers' missions, I arrived to Honduras a few days before the election, and I stayed until I became addicted to tear gas. But during the days after the election, both the OAS and the European Union mission remained too silent as to let the problem grow so big, until it was undeniable, that the irregularities were so big that it was very hard to call a winner without suspicion that it was a fraud. I must stop here and just say before that even before the election, the suspicions of fraud were really big. We would have foreseen this crisis, and we foresaw it. We just didn't, nobody knew that it was going to last so long. This is preposterous by now. But why did we know this beforehand? Because you can't go to a game knowing that the referee is already biased. The referee was so biased that fraud was called even before the first Honduran put the vote into the urns. Why was it biased, if you want me to enter into details? Because the opposition didn't have any presence in the Supreme Electoral Tribunal, and it was totally controlled by the president, except for the fourth magistrado. How do you say magistrado? The fourth judge, or the fourth member of the tribunal, that comes from a small party, and that quickly decided he was not going to remain silent during all this process. Irregularities happened the same night of the election. The system went down when candidate Nasralla was up by 5 points, and it went down twice, and then when it came back, then suddenly President Hernández was up again. This is the main irregularity that has not been explained, and the main irregularity that the OAS claims now, that according to their technicians, data was introduced to the system from outside. That's what the OAS says, that their techniques confirm these claims by the opposition, which has given place to all this situation. I went this morning to the press conference of candidate Nasralla, who is in Washington. He met yesterday with the OAS. As you all know, the OAS said that the only solution they can foresee is new elections, which is, of course, much easier to say than to do. Because, first of all, you have a winner declared by the Supreme Electoral Tribunal, which is a winner, by the way, absolutely supported by the United States since his unconstitutional moves to get reelected, who controls all the main institutionality in Honduras. And this candidate has been declared the winner. So how do you sit down and negotiate with a guy that already won and has been declared the winner? It was published today in the Gaceta Oficial, which is the official, and I don't know how to put this, the Honduran official media, meaning that if any opposition candidate wants to impugnate the results, it has, I don't know if it's 5 or 10 days after it's published in the Gaceta Oficial. Well, it was published today, which means it's official, institutionally official. He is the winner of the elections. So how do you sit down and negotiate with somebody that already won? And what can you offer him to sit down and negotiate? Well, the only counterweight right now is, well, there's two counterweights. First, there's the social counterweight, which are the streets. And second, there's a political counterweight, which is the OAS saying we don't recognize this, which turns us back to 2009, when the country was also isolated by the international community because of an irregular, if you want to call it an irregular democratic transition, or an anti-democratic transition, or a coup d'etat, yes, or a coup d'etat. No, I was taken back to my days in Honduras. In Honduras, depends on who you talk to. When you say coup d'etat, everybody leaves the room. So, because yeah, it was a political crisis or the democratic transition of power. It was a coup d'etat, effectively. So that's the situation right now. And even if President Hernández agreed to sit down, and even if he agreed to new elections, then you have to start again from scratch. Who is going to be called to the election? Only these two candidates? Or are you going to repeat the whole election with all the candidates that participated? Who is going to be the referee this time? Are you going to do it with the same Tribunal Supreme Electoral? That's unacceptable for the opposition. That's absolutely unacceptable. They need to have a presence. Who is going to name these members of the Tribunal Supreme Electoral? which company will organize all the electronic services for the income of the data? The same one that already was, at least it was hacked from outside? This is a poor country, and the Constitution demands that the president takes office in January. So we have the time clicking, although I know there's a constitutional article that will open the door for more time until the next elections. But right now, that's a political crisis. So I've been making phone calls to some people that I consider brilliant. None of them has a solution for this stalemate. So if you want, I'll stop here, and then we can.
They're not as brilliant as the people in this room, Carlos. These people have a solution here. You'll hear it in a second. Okay.
During the questions, we can ask them.
Okay. Lisa, why don't we turn to you, and served in Honduras, and what's your take on what's happening?
Okay. Well, I was going to go back and talk about 2013. And the reason is that's the election that I experienced and worked on and supported as best I could with the rest of the U.S. government team and with our international colleagues and with the Hondurans. And some of this is, what did it look like then? What does it look like now? Carlos has given you a great description of what it looks like now. But I can point out a few things. When we were looking at the election of 2013, 2009 was on everybody's minds, and people were, and the problem was that when Pepe Lobo was elected president, not everybody recognized that his election was legitimate, and so it really put the onus on making 2013 a very successful election. The second was the circumstances, political, security, economic, that Honduras faced at that time were really, really, really grave. Record high homicides, lots of extortions, a deteriorating economy. Things were really bad. And on top of that, you had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which had done really good work in coming up with a long list of recommendations to avoid a 2009 in the future. But not all those recommendations had been implemented. So some of the problems that exist even today, what's the role of the political parties in the TSE, in the Tribunal, those problems still exist. What we did at the time was we mobilized with the G16 and actually also with the Honduran government very early. I don't know if people here recall that the G16 was fairly outspoken at the time and negotiated an agreement with the Hondurans about, I can't remember if it was 15 or 18 months in advance, on what were the priorities for the next period of time up till the end of the Pepe Lobo term. And that included trying to get elections right. And the U.S. government worked with UNDP, worked with all these different G16 donors. And between us, we funded experts, we funded observers, we funded voter registration drives, we paid for some equipment, we paid for signage. And I personally, we met with all the political parties and said, please keep calm, please do this by the book. I met with all the presidential candidates a couple of times saying, please keep calm, do it by the book, tell your people to keep calm. We looked for hot spots before the election and went out to those communities with the same message. What do you think is going to happen? Can you help us keep it calm? And we also had a message of how important it was to vote and vote your conscience and vote for the candidate you thought was going to actually be able to help start to resolve the problems of the country. So we didn't have a preferred candidate. We had the same message for everybody. We also, speaking at that time for the U.S., we also met with all the political parties at once, and then in another session with a lot of civil society groups. And we said, look, here are the kinds of things we work on, here are the kinds of things we support. If your interests are the same, there are ways we could collaborate, we could cooperate. And so while today it looks like I've heard this accusation, Juan Orlando is our best friend. In fact, what was going on was we were aligning our interests and working on projects where we had similar interests, which were there were quite a few of those. So those elections, they were contested after the election, but they were peaceful. They did have massive turnout, and after a number of days, most people seemed to accept those election results, and so it had a feel-good moment. And it meant that the government could get going, could hit the ground running when they came in. So some of the problems that existed then still exist. They're not always with the same weight, but blank credentials, selling votes at the tables, at the mesas, the role of the political parties, who should be, the role at the mesas, the role vis-a-vis the TSE. I think it was the first time they had electronic transmission of results, so how was that going to work? They squabbled over the companies, who was going to be the company, how was it going to work, was there enough time to test, did they test at full capacity, all of those questions. Training, the parties, some parties did better than others in lining up the number of people to be at the tables, so was there enough time for training all of them? No, there wasn't enough time. And then hanging over that whole thing was that they had never fully resolved the 2009 problems. So a lot of these things are going on today. All of these irregularities and the violence that's occurred afterwards, they definitely need to be investigated. There are lots and lots of accusations. There certainly is lots of violence that everybody can see, but who's doing what to whom, it needs to be looked at in a professional and serious way, because if you don't do that, you can't really resolve the issue. How to get out of the mess. I wrote, there are no easy answers, exactly what Carlos said, nobody has an answer. But there will be no resolution with the violence continuing, period. And I thought of at least 5 or 6 ways that violence will really screw up the country. First, it obviously injures and kills some people. Regardless of who's doing it, people get hurt, people get killed. Second thing, it hurts businesses in a really big way. Honduras was beginning to get back on its feet in a macroeconomic sense, and there was more business confidence and so on. It can be lost. Their efforts at tourism can definitely be lost. It creates opportunities for criminals to take advantage of the loss of control. So, when there's chaos, you have more problems that way. The polarization that we thought was beginning to subside, wasn't gone, but was beginning to subside, came back. And that will probably now last for a while. The confidence that many Hondurans were beginning to feel, I used to spend a lot of time saying, sí se puede, sí se puede. It was the Obama years, we could say that. Went over well in Honduras. But finally, it is greatly damaging the reputation of the country. When I've seen press reports going back to saying, Honduras used to be called a banana republic, and, that's the reputational aspect. So number one is, I hope whoever is a leader in their community or of their political party or in government or anywhere urges an end to the violence, because these costs are very high for Honduras and they will last if this violence continues. And the corollary to that is everybody needs to be encouraged to put country first, to think constructively, not destructively, not just complain that something didn't happen the right way, but say, okay, how are we going to get out of the mess? And think a little bit, at least medium term. The second thing is time. Obviously, a couple of things. One is there's now this 5-day window for additional impugnaciones, complaints, formal complaints. you can't just diss the system and walk away. You have to deal with a system that exists. You may not like it, may be very imperfect, I get it, but you have to exhaust your avenues, and that's one of them. So people should use that. The second thing is time. If I agree with what Carlos said, you know, if everybody were to agree to new elections, who would object to that? The catch is it's not part of the law. People can decide not to pay attention to the law, I understand. But with exactly what Carlos said, with the credibility of the TSE in doubt by many people, who's the referee? Who's going to decide who the winner is? And if you say, well, we'll go to the Supreme Court after that, okay, when you don't like what the Supreme Court says, what are you going to do then? It doesn't get you anywhere. You have to decide who's going to pay for the elections, how long is it going to take, all the logistics of it, and if it happens to go past January 27th or whenever the inauguration date is, who runs the country after that? So, not that there's anything wrong with new elections, except the practical aspects are daunting. But I understand why it would be desirable. At the other extreme, I think it's the other extreme, you could try to make a deal. You'd have to think of what would encourage all sides to do this, that says, okay, these elections weren't what we wanted them to be, but we will sign a document that promises to do electoral reform in the Congress and maybe with a national dialogue of some sort. And we're going to get it done in a certain time frame. Now, clearly, that's also difficult. You know, it didn't happen up to now, despite actually many, many years of talking about this subject, because political interest didn't align. But if people focused on what does the country need, can you get on with continuing to build the economy into poverty, improve security even more, all these things, if you could get people to focus on that as a goal, there is a small chance. But you'd have to get a document that said they're going to do electoral reform. So that is basically what I wanted to say. I hope this doesn't go on too long, and I'm happy to hear all your comments and questions later.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Lisa. Well, if there are no easy answers, we have Juan Gonzalez. Fortunately, we have him to give us the perspective. Juan, thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Is this on? Can you hear me? Yeah. Does it work? Okay. Yeah. Okay, so I have the benefit of not working for the U.S. government and actually being able to speak my mind. So I might try to be a little provocative in my views here. I think what is happening in Honduras, in many ways, as you mentioned, is something that has been a problem for the Honduran system for a very long time. And I would say that is a small Honduran elite that does not trust popular will, regardless this elite of what political group or ideology they belong to. We saw that with the removal of Mel Zelaya, who essentially wanted to conduct a poll and was put on a plane out of the country. And we've seen that in elections since, in terms of actually trying to resolve this issue in a backroom conversation, as opposed to making sure that there's a sound electoral process that guarantees that the Honduran people determine the outcome of the election. I think that's important, and I think the U.S. response to this has a lot more to do than just Honduras. This is really, I think, the first test of how this administration is really going to address issues of breakdown in democracy, and are we going to treat those who are very close to us and that we work with really well the same that we would those that we disagree. And I think consistency is going to be incredibly important. So I'm going to start with the role of the United States and a commentary. Actually, on the way here, I was telling Michael that I'm an avid journal taker, and I was involved in Honduras in some way or another since the 2009 coup, from being the person that put together the list of the type of assistance that would be suspended to toward the end of the administration is Das actually meeting with President Hernandez and members of his team to implement the Alliance for Prosperity. And as I was looking through the notes back from 2009, what was the United States doing? You had an assistant secretary that had been confirmed by the U.S. Senate. You had Tom Shannon, who was still on the job. You had a principal deputy assistant secretary, Ambassador Craig Kelly, who had been ambassador to Chile, who was going to Honduras so often that they were talking about naming a reception area after him, jokingly. But actually, the shuttle diplomacy that he engaged with, and then a series of ambassadors, including Ambassador Kubisky, who were also confirmed by the U.S. Senate, and actually were speaking on behalf of the U.S. government, had a lot of backing from Washington, and were able to move, I think, in a much more aggressive way. Right now, even though we have people that I've worked with who I would respect greatly, Heidi Bronke is the chargé. She is amazing. You have Paco Palmieri, who's acting right now, who knows Honduras intimately and has been engaged in the issue. And I'm going to also embarrass Oliva Lopez, who is probably one of the best desk officers I've had the honor to work with on Honduras. So you have people that are incredibly good at what they're doing, but the lack of a political top cover is something that actually is hamstringing the State Department, and I would posit led to some of the unforced errors with regard to the certification that you may be familiar with, that came out 2 days after the electoral vote, that essentially certified that Honduras was cooperating on human rights and transparency, which is, maybe you could have waited a week, but I think it's just the fact that you had a lot of professionals, not a lot of top cover actually managing the timing of this issue is significant. I would also be critical in the rush of the State Department to come out and essentially side with the Supreme Electoral Council and not waiting to see how you could actually try to organize some sort of international response. So this to me suggests one of two things. One is that maybe this administration is taking an approach of supporting our friends and not those that we disagree with, that the administration, that there's disagreement between the Organization of American States and the administration in the fact that there was no mention of irregularities in the vote or the call by the Secretary General to call for a new election. And that's concerning, because if the United States is not actually strengthening or supporting the Organization of American States to do its role, to actually bring together a group of countries behind a solution, then we have a problem. And Honduras, who is one of our, actually I would say in Central America in the Alliance for Prosperity, one of the countries that we worked with the closest, if you can't actually have that conversation with a close ally, then you lose credibility. I'm sorry to say, okay? With regard to the process, I'll say that and I'll mention a few points on the actual election dynamics, though there are experts here that know this much better than I do, but I think we have to go back to when the changes to re-election were made. That's where this started. And it created particular challenges for the United States, because the United States, for people that have worked in the region for a while, are everybody's solution, but also everybody's problem. If we get too involved, we get criticized. If we don't get involved enough, then we're an absentee partner. And so when it comes to the issue of presidential re-election in Latin America, it's been very difficult for us to actually, particularly under the Obama-Biden administration, to come out with a concrete position that did not come across as paternalistic. Certainly for the United States, having consecutive re-election or having re-election is something that works for us. We don't have a solution that actually necessarily worked for the governments of the region, but we are very clear on the matter of indefinite re-election. And Michael Camilleri and others spent a lot of time debating how to actually best approach this issue. And so what does the United States say when throughout the process you have a sitting president who has a lot of influence in the institutions of government and had his party actually pushed through to actually have changes, and the ultimate decision by the court is comparable to what other presidents in the region are doing by suggesting that the president's human rights were violated by preventing his right to be reelected? Is that strong on legal grounds? It's not for me to say or for the United States to say, because it's a Honduran decision. But the breakdown happened then. Then you actually get to election day. And the election day, I have to say that it puts into perspective a very important question, which is maybe Juan Orlando Hernández, and most likely Juan Orlando Hernández won the popular vote in this election. But the question is, were the irregularities, the systematic failures in the system, the silence and the mistakes in messaging on the behalf of the Supreme Electoral Council, were they so egregious that they merit a re-election? Is really the question. Does that actually invalidate the popular vote in this instance? Was the breakdown such that that it would actually undermine the president's legitimacy and would actually disrupt the political process? That's a question that I think would be worth, debating in here. But what ended up happening, I think, and actually just kind of the breakdown was, you actually had a moment where the first count was announced by the TSC the night of the election. And with, I think it was 57% of the vote counted, you had Nasralla was up by 45%, 45 and change, and you had President Hernandez behind by he was at 40 and change, right? So he was behind. Immediately, you actually had that's where the breakdown started, where both candidates declared victory, right? There was no waiting to actually have some sort of certified result. There was spin on either side where folks are actually interpreting the quick count, were choosing aspects of the data to favor either the candidate that they backed. And then you had a TSC that essentially took the process behind into a back room and took actions that some would interpret as intentionally to favor the incumbent. And you had essentially a power outage a couple days into the election, where a lot of the things that happened, you could say, were a series of just inconvenient breakdowns in the process, that were a series of mistakes that were representative of a flawed process, or they were by design. And that's, I think, a very difficult question to answer. I know that the TSC undertook its own audit. I know the OAS is actually also doing an audit to figure out if there was actual tampering involved. And they may very well find out that there was tampering involved in the election, but did it make a difference and would it have gotten Nasralla elected? Or is Juan Orlando Hernández still the guy that won most likely the presidential election? That's difficult to actually answer what you do. You hold a new election, or do we just say, well, we'll fix the next one because President Hernandez did win the electoral vote? I mean, I would posit that the way forward, and I would say, I'll mention a little bit about what the U.S., including the U.S. Congress, can do in this instance. Going forward, there has to be a real conversation and negotiation between the National Party and the Liberal Party. Up to now, and you've all probably read about it, that the Nasralla, and when I mean Nasralla, I mean Mel Zelaya, behind the scenes actually managing the machine, is actually being consistent in its demands. Initially, the opposition, the challenger, said, we're going to challenge the 5,000 actas that are in question. Then they switched and said, no, we want the entire vote reviewed. No, we want the election completely invalidated. They signed an agreement shortly after the election called the Declaration of Honduras Democracy, to actually ensure that people that were supporting the parties weren't out in the streets protesting, that they would respect the results of the re-election, they would go through an orderly process to challenge the results. 24 hours pass, Nasralla pulls out of that. And so I don't think we can actually lay the entire blame here on the TSC, which is biased in favor of President Hernandez. I don't think we can blame President Hernandez entirely. I think we need to look at an opposition that maybe right now is benefiting from the current state of chaos that exists in the country. For the United States, I think there's a very quick call for, by the Hill and folks that have been advocating on this issue for a very long time, for the United States to, either break diplomatic relations, move to remove Honduras from the OAS as was done in 2009, or to suspend all assistance. I think the situation is much more complex, and we need to actually unpack that issue to see where the United States can have an impact where it remains at the table with both sides, and one that but still allows us to continue to exert pressure on the government and the institutions to find some sort of third way out of this mess. There have been calls by Senator Cardin and others, and I would not be surprised if Senator Herlihy is already place holds on funding, which I'm sure he has. So I think regardless of where the administration goes, the players in the United States are going to be, you're going to have the White House, you're going to have the State Department perhaps either aligned or slightly off the perspective from where the White House is. But I think you're also going to have a U.S. Congress that's going to take a much more active role given the increased amount of funding that has actually gone to Honduras and the rest of Central America under the previous administration and then going into this one. So I'll just leave it there.
Thank you very much, Juan. That was terrific. Let me just open up with one question, and then I'll invite all of you to comment. But this is really for the three of you, if you could, because all of you have talked about the 2009 coup. Oh, what was that? Transition? Yeah. Whatever Carlos's term was it. And just want to pick up. Carlos, you said that one of the counterweights to this, there are two. One is the internal social pressure, and the other is sort of the international community. But the fact of the matter is that we have an administration, and that really hasn't, seems to be soft pedaling, not doing very much, and kind of doesn't know how to react. And what you have is the OAS, but the OAS is the Secretary General of the OAS. What are the other government? In the case of the coup in 2009, you had a remarkable consensus opposing the coup for different reasons. You had ALBA countries, you had Brazil, Chile, because they had gone through coups. And then, of course, you had the Obama administration in its first months that also wanted to establish very clearly where it stood on democracy, and they kind of converged in some ways. Here you have a convergence as well, but the convergences do nothing. The exception of it is the Secretary General of the Organization of American States. Not sure to what extent his view reflects the opinions of member governments. You can answer that, but we had the President of Colombia, Juan Orlando Santos, who's congratulated Juan Orlando. I don't hear anything from any other government in the region. So perhaps you could respond to that a little bit. And then also Lisa's comment that there's nothing wrong with new elections, that there's just a lot of practical problems. Well, there's also a political problem. These people, and Juan Orlando doesn't want to lose power. And the risk is that if you have a new election, means you can lose. And if you lose, that's, you want to hold on to power. And that was the same thing in 2009. What was the most striking aspect of 2009 to me was that despite all the pressure of the United States and the regional community on a country like Honduras, this de facto government that replaced Zelaya didn't budge. And then the United States eventually sort of, became pragmatic and backed off and said, we got to deal with them, we'll have new elections, we'll move forward. So, I mean, isn't this what we're dealing with, that there's really, and that this, this Juan Orlando Hernández, who represents the elites in Honduras, is just got to sort of dig in. And, I mean, we could talk about dialogue and so forth, but at the end of the day, he's going to stay in power. You want to comment on that?
Yeah. Before I say anything, I meant to say one thing right at the top, particularly because this is streaming and hopefully streaming in Honduras as well, which is to express my condolences to everybody who died in that airplane crash a couple of days ago, including Hilda Hernandez, but all of them. I knew Hilda before her husband was publicly running for office when she was doing some anti-poverty work, and she was trying to figure out how to create a database that would allow the government, the Lobo government in those days, to target assistance to the truly needy. And it was beautiful work. And so I just wanted to express my condolences to the Hernandez family, but also to all of the families of the people who died in that crash. To move on to your point, I think you're right. It's kind of amazing how few other governments have said anything. And I guess, somebody ought to gin up. Maybe, there ought to be some sort of statement or some sort of conversation about that and start off behind the scenes and then get more public. In terms of logistical, your point is well taken, except that I did say if the parties agreed to have elections, there would be nothing wrong except for all the logistical problems. If the parties agree is also unlikely, but you would have to find a way to make it in their interest. And presumably if both sides think they won, maybe you could build on that and say, if you think you won, what's the risk? This will buy you some legitimacy. Because what happens right now is that if they can't resolve it, whoever, Juan Orlando being declared the winner, he'll face these legitimacy problems like Pepe Lobo faced, and it will really impede how much he can get done. It will be a problem.
Thanks. Juan, do you have any thoughts?
So, a general commentary just on the maybe on 2009 and why it's relevant, but maybe different now, is that, so in 2009, you're right. Under the Martinelli de facto government, the level of
Micheletti,
is the level of stubbornness and disregard for the international community was deep. And I think in this regard, it's important for the United States to not be rigid in the outcome that it wants. I think from the very beginning, we pushed for the return of Mel Zelaya as the democratically elected president. And then actually for them to maybe enter, if they have an impeachment mechanism, to go through that process instead of putting the man on a plane, But I would add as well that one of the reasons in the kind of negotiations that were taking place under the de facto government after 2009, one of the biggest challenges was also the inconsistency and desire to kind of continue to disrupt by Mel Zelaya. I don't think we can give him a pass here because he never served as a logical actor, would shift his demands. We accompanied Arturo Valenzuela, Ambassador Kelly, and I went to the consulate and met with him inside, and you never knew which Mel Zelaya you were going to get. And I think this is the same thing that's going on here, is that, I think Hernandez could very well say, look, the TSC has validated the outcome. I'm now going to focus on governing, and these protests are going to be unsustainable in the medium to long term. And he's right. I think the difference now is, you still have a Mel Zelaya that is not a logical actor. And I think, and this is me thinking out loud, is that Zelaya perhaps believes that he can control Nasralla, or that he can make sure that Nasralla has one term and then he knows he can bring him down in the next election. And that's what he's playing at. The difference now is that you have a huge investment by the United States in Honduras, by the international community, and the outcome needs to be one that has that brings some validity or credibility to the outcome. If not, then I think what the President Hernandez will unfortunately find is the agenda that he has, which I recognize is a very ambitious agenda to address matters of corruption, to keep the country growing economically. There's a lot wrong with it as well. But he will find that he starts running into problems with multilateral development banks. He will find that the main interlocutor for him will be the U.S. Congress, because they will hold, I imagine, funding. They will hold any ambassadors that are nominated until they get answers. We lived through this in 2009, and it was a long, arduous, and painful process for the U.S. government, but also for Honduras. And I think now the stakes are much higher.
Thanks. Carlos? Should we expect Latin American governments to get involved in this? Any of them?
You're right in a sense when you say it's not the OAS, it's the Secretary General. Yes, but it's based on a technical report from the mission of observers. And let's not forget that this mission of observers was not headed by Evo Morales. It was headed by Jorge Quiroga from Bolivia, one of the most rightist political characters in the region. Right? That's his report. So it's a political statement, yes, by the Secretary General of the OAS, but based on a technical report. I mean, the irregularities of the process are not a political position. Right? The irregularities that's a political position, yes, but that comes from a technical report. The irregularities are so big that if you don't want to call it a fraud, you must call it the biggest incompetence in Latin American elections, and believe me, we have many. Now, about the United States, and I don't mean to put any of you on the spot, but my recollection of what's been going on there, it's a bit different. I covered the coup d'etat, or the democratic transition, in 2009. I was there for a long time after that. The resistance organizations that started then are the ones you're seeing today on the streets of Honduras and on the political environment of Honduras. It's a much more organized base. It's not going to be that easy for them just to say the popular mobilizations are going to recede as it was in 2009. Maybe by force they could. I returned to Honduras because I wanted to see, like 2 years ago, what was the real story. We had two very different versions. One is the version of the United States and Juan Orlando Hernández. This is a very modern country. It's going into development. It's getting better and better. It's progressive. We can work with him. The support of the U.S. ambassador that just left a few, Ambassador Nealon, was so open that it was almost obscene. I have to say beforehand that I am not Chinese or Russian, I'm Salvadoran. And being Salvadoran, I have to tell you, I have not seen any country in Latin America where the United States has so much influence as in Honduras. Not any single one. Whatever the United States says, and that's what today everybody is waiting for, the word of the United States. And I mean today, right? After Nasralla's meeting with the State Department. Because in the end, everybody in Honduras feels that the United States has the key. Right? Can you imagine that a presidential candidate in the middle of this huge political crisis takes an airplane to meet here with third-level State Department officers? That's how influential the United States is for Honduras. So when I started going back there to see what was going on, there were these two stories. There was this story of Honduras as a country that was raising back from the coup d'etat, which was fighting corruption, which was, is, according to the United States version, is enhancing human rights. It's protecting human rights, and it's advancing in every single sense. The story is so well sold that even the US ambassador in El Salvador told Salvadorans that we should look at Honduras as a model, not long ago. The other version of the story is the story of NGOs, human rights organizations, and anti-corruption movements all over the world, saying this is a country where environmental activists are being killed, saying this is a country where the president has held the power of all institutionality in Honduras. This is a country where the president has created its own military police that responds to him. And this is a country that is being sold out to the elites, taking over the lands of the indigenous and peasants. That was the other story. So as a journalist, you go and see the two versions of the story and you expect to find some middle ground. The truth is that they have progressed in certain ways in infrastructure, for example. They have built a beautiful highway. It's really a beautiful highway between Tegucigalpa and San Pedro Sula, paid by US taxpayers, that has already been privatized. The truth is that this president has extradited to the United States big drug traffickers. That's true. Is that an advancement? Of course it is. Thanks to these extraditions, in the trials held in New York courts, we are finding out that this is not a country with corrupt officers. This is a corrupt system where private power, public power, and organized crime are working together in many ways. That's what has allowed this president to hold so much power and pervert the institutionality in ways as to name the Supreme Court the way he did, that allowed him to run for re-election, with the support of the United States. This is the same president that managed to get the Congress to elect a Supreme Electoral Tribunal by night at the end of the period of the Congress, to leave out of the tribunal the Alianza Opositora. And this is the same president that also is controlling the government. Not just a week ago, and I'm sorry about the timing, the mission, not only my timing, but also the timing of the OAS mission against corruption in Honduras. They published their first report. Their first findings say that some lawmakers in Honduras received money through ghost organizations. Maxi didn't dare to say to do what, but these are the same lawmakers that named the Supreme Court magistrados that allowed for the re-election of Juan Orlando Hernández. Right? During these days, what happened was that while the OAS was saying there were so many irregularities in the process, the Chargé d'Affaires of the United States, which is the highest US officer in Honduras, a woman named Heidi Fulton, appeared next to the president of the tribunal, of the Supreme Electoral Tribunal, next to him, right? Supporting the work of the most marred electoral tribunal that we can remember. The truth is that in the middle of this political crisis, and with environmentalists being killed, and with people being killed on the streets, the State Department issues a certification that says that Honduras has made significant progress fighting corruption and fighting and pro-human rights. The truth is that this report comes after we still don't know anything about the huge social security fraud that was committed during the last year of President Porfirio Lobo, for which there's only like 3 people in prison and it never went up. So that's what I found when I went to cover Honduras back there.
You don't have to hold back, Carlos. That's fine. Thank you.
So let me just. Oh, sorry, Mark. Yes, just let me finish. Yes, I'm sorry. So right now, we are all waiting to see what's the U.S. response. Nasralla said today at the National Press Club that the State Department officers that he met with said that they thanked him for the visit and that they were reviewing the OAS and the European Union report. Everybody in Honduras was calling me today saying, were you in the press conference? What happened at the State Department? Well, that's what a big role the United States play here. Now, having said this, and again, I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but I would like to ask you, if you were in office now, and I know you're not anymore, what would you recommend Secretary Tillerson to do? What would you recommend the U.S. position to be?
I want to go back to a couple of things that you said. Huh?
You're still in government.
No, I'm not.
Oh, so okay.
We're going to have to open it up pretty soon, so if you could just be brief.
Okay. Number one, the timing of that certification was kind of accidental, and it had to do with delays in getting the report out. Okay, so it's wrong to associate those two things. The second thing is, I know that when I was there, I never said there was lack of corruption. I used the word corruption and it scared everybody. I also used the word narco trafficker and that scared everybody. Obviously there were and there still are issues around corruption. Transparency International's report, constantly shows those results. But and it's also true that the economic progress has been very much on the macroeconomic side, the IMF report, for example, and less on the eliminating poverty side. But I know when I was there, we were doing some really good work on the anti-poverty side as well. And the numbers weren't as big as they we would want them to be, but the program was doing really well, and it was doing well in rural areas. So I wouldn't ignore that. What would I do now? My SOP my standard procedure was to go around, talk to everybody, say, what do you think should happen? How do you think this can get resolved? And try to find the consensus among them and repeat their words back to them, having done that analysis. That's what, another way of saying that is there has to be a national dialogue, but you have to do it in a way that it's not just grandstanding. It's what people are, when you make them think seriously about what needs to be done. That's what I would do. The other thing I want to tell you that might make you laugh was before I was in Honduras, I was in Brazil. And in Brazil, and before that, I was some years earlier in Hong Kong. In those two countries, if you dared tell those people what the U.S. thought they should do, particularly in Brazil, they about killed you. What are you doing? So when I got to Honduras, I said, I'm not going to be a proconsul. I'm going to listen. And people had the reaction that you described. Why isn't the U.S. talking? So I did talk more and more as time went on, but I can't speak for Neelan.
Thanks. Well,
look, I think well, the U.S. can't, and I think you ascribe way too much power to the United States because the ability of the...
And I didn't mention the DEA presence, by the way.
Well, the ability of the de facto government in 2009 to just blow us off was something that would maybe make you modify the amount of power that the United States government has. But look, I think there is, in terms of the messaging by the United States in public or in private, there needs to be an expectation by the part of the international community, not just the United States, that the outcome of this process must be democratic. It's difficult to answer whether the breakdown was such that you could say that this was a breakdown of the democratic order in Honduras. And I think that's something that behind the scenes, the United States can pressure Zelaya to the table, can also pressure our friends that are in the current government to try to find a way forward that is acceptable to both. But publicly, I would have delayed any sort of statement until you came out with the EU. I would have actually mentioned or referred to what the Secretary General has called for. And I would focus on the process and not just essentially check the box because the TSC has come out and validated the results of the election.
Okay. Thank you. We're going to open it up. Before I do so, I just want to say that we invited representatives of the Trump administration to participate in this panel. And we also have had over the years Juan Orlando Hernández speak here. Well, first when he was head of Congress and then as president. And we've also had a meeting with Salvador Nasralla, not on this current visit. This wasn't included, but about a month and a half ago or so, he came by the dialogue and we had a private meeting with him. So we've met with him as well. What I'd like to do is ask people to make comments and questions, and we'll collect all of them. And if the speakers could sort of take notes of the questions and then respond to the ones that they want to, the easy ones, and leave the hard ones for the next panel. Yeah, sure. Identify yourselves, please. There'll be microphones going around, and please be brief. We're going to start with Peter Hakam, since everybody knows who he is. He doesn't have to identify himself, but here's a microphone. And then just please raise your hand if you want to make a comment.
Let me ask. Is this on?
Yeah.
Okay. Does anyone on the panel really think anything is going to come out of this besides a second term for Juan Orlando Hernández, who is going to put down the social opposition through repression or through some other way? But is there anyone who doubts that 4 years from now we're going to see another election, but Juan Orlando will be president at that time?
Okay, thank you. Other comments? Yeah, why don't we go here?
Hi, my name's David Morgan. I'm coming from a consulting firm that works in international development called Banyan Global here in Washington, D.C. And I wanted to ask if one of you could clarify what is Juan Orlando Hernández's position on the irregularities. Is he saying, no, there were no irregularities, everything was fine with the election, I'm the president? Or has he admitted that there were irregularities And if he has, what is his proposed solution to that? Because it seems like how far these irregularities went has a huge, will have a big impact on whether it could have swayed the election one way or the other. So if you could comment on that, that would be great.
Okay, thanks. Why don't we go to Eric here? Just wait for the microphone.
Eric Hirschberg from American University. I guess my question's for Carlos. My sense is that what you discovered as a journalist is also what those of us doing academic research on Honduras have concluded as well. And the question then becomes, in this environment, and where I think it's pretty clear that with the possible exception of some members of Congress, the U.S. government's going to go along with this. And Juan Orlando Hernández has done what the U.S. government wants him to do, and he'll continue to. The question then is there any combination of dynamics in the street or dynamics in Honduran institutions or of international engagement other than the United States that could change Hernández's calculation and lead him to contemplate an alternative plan B?
Okay, thanks. You have a question back there.
Hi, Adrian Ariano from George Washington University. So 2 weeks ago, the National Police kind of disobeyed orders and were no longer suppressing people on the street, which I thought, I can't remember the last time Latin American cops kind of disobeyed orders. So my question is, when do you guys talk about perhaps like the cohesion of the security forces in Honduras and what factor that will play in either maintaining the power of Juan Orlando or kind of transitioning to the next phase?
We'll go to Ambassador Aparicio. Right there's a microphone.
Oh, thank you. I'm Aparicio. I used to be head of electoral missions for the Carter Center, and I was a mandor probably 2 months ago at the Atlantic Center, and General Kelly was speaking about Central America. He was very enthusiastic about President Hernández and his government, extremely, I would say, and saying he's a personal friend, so you could see that there was a lot of support. My question now is do you foresee a conflict between the U.S. and the OAS at some point during this crisis?
Thanks. Why don't we go back there? Is it okay then? Yeah, please.
Hi, Alex Sanchez. I'm a defense analyst, or at some places. I'm going to piggyback on the question about the security forces. On December 3rd, the Honduran military came out with a statement saying that they're apolitical, that they have no role in the protest for one side or another. Do you think that still stands, or do they have become more pro-government, or do they remain apolitical? I remember maybe 4 or 5 days ago, on December 15, a truck was burned, a military truck was burned in El Carrizal, and the Honduran military actually published a press release in its website saying it was carried out by members of the opposition, of the Alianza de la Oposición. So I'm wondering, can we say that the Honduran military remains apolitical, or is it taking a side more than another? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir. Please. Yeah.
Yeah, it's Jake Johnson with the Center for Economic and Policy Research. And I just want to make a comment around the 2009 coup and the U.S. response to that. And certainly, there's this perception that maybe the U.S. didn't have a big impact because the de facto government didn't listen to you, as Mr. Gonzalez said. But there was also a lot of other things happening with the U.S. government there. I think that was the only message that was coming across is certainly not accurate. I've spoken to a number of former military officers, for example, who said that they had spoken to the Honduran military and had said, it'll be okay, our relationship will continue in the end. Also, we're talking about the OAS here and Almagro's role. So I think it's worth pointing out that back in 2009, the U.S. actually engineered the Honduran situation outside of the OAS and started a separate process with former Costa Rican President Arias at the head. So I just think that's relevant in terms of discussion here and what role the U.S. could be playing.
Thank you very much. Dan Erickson.
Is he allowed to ask questions?
Yeah, but you don't have to answer. That's the only thing. You can ignore the question if you want.
Dan Erickson, just on the question of the OAS, if the OAS is essentially called for a do-over of the election and the government of Honduras ignores them, then does it raise the question of what's the point of these electoral monitoring missions? This is a real credibility test and a stress test. And if it has no impact on the government's behavior, then I think it raises real questions about those. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Why don't we start with the final question, and then we'll go back to Lisa, Juan, and Carlos.
Thank you, Jean Stoken with the Sisters of Mercy. And, you know, part of it when I'm going to raise the human rights issue, but also while we're giving condolences, there were 22 people from social movements killed in the last 3 weeks, too. So we probably should give sympathy to the whole, to all those who are suffering. Could you reflect on what U.S. policy could have done differently that might have gotten us at this point in a whole other situation? And going back, for example, whether, in the question I guess at hand is U.S. influence, whether or not if we said something more at the technical coup in 2012 when the 4 Supreme Court judges were changed in the middle of the night, or if we said something more challenging and did more against the military police that were put in, or if we did more on the corruption, and the Berta Cáceres case, just one, when so much information is out there. So is our silence in some of these moments, particularly around the role of President Hernandez in the last couple of years, contributed to even, again, that he runs a second term? So what can we learn about U.S. policy, what mistakes were made by support, but at least the perceived support of one side?
Thanks. Thank you all for your questions. Ronnie, we'll let you have the last question, and then we'll go back to Lisa. You got a microphone behind you, right there.
Okay, I'm Ronald McLean from Bolivia. And given that in Latin America in general, there is this wave of extra-constitutional re-election, which I think is a real virus against democracy, and with no affinity to former President Zelaya, I think that to be even, something has to happen in Honduras to redo the program. It's in the defense of democracy. Otherwise, I see something that happened in Bolivia with Sanchez de Lozada. He got elected forcefully in a way for the second time, and he lasted 8 months. There were people killed on the streets, and there were repression, and so on and so forth.
Thank you. Lisa, why don't we start with you, and then Juan and Carlos.
Okay, so I think I'll speak to U.S. influence. I don't see Juan Orlando as a patsy for the U.S. And I'll tell you the biggest example of it is that the U.S. was not a supporter of creating a military police. And we were pretty vocal about that. And he basically said, I don't care what the U.S. says, we're going to create a military police because I think that's the only police that will be effective. And we said, okay, it's your country, you do that, we're not funding it, we're not training it. You know, we've put our money on the national police. So just, that's an example, he's not a patsy. Another example that is where I thought we were, a smaller example where I thought we were successful. There was a big debate about government regulation of content in the media. And the U.S. thought that that would limit freedom of expression in an unacceptable way. And so what I said was, why don't we just, you know, the issues involved are legitimate issues. You know, how do you give everybody a voice and so on? Why don't we bring down a representative from our FCC who can tell you how we do it in the U.S., how we address those kinds of issues in the U.S. The U.S. is not Honduras, it's a different situation, but it will give you some ideas. And so we put together a visit for this person. They spoke to the president, they spoke to the Congress, they spoke to civil society, they went all over, spoke to the media as well. And in the end, they came up with a solution that preserved freedom of the press and freedom of broadcast in a way that was, to our minds, a little bit more acceptable. So there are times when he goes along, but it's because we persuaded him. There are other times when he doesn't because he believes firmly in something. Now, so the trick becomes, what would persuade him? You know, what arguments can you bring to the table that would persuade him? He's not different from other people. That's the issue anytime you have a negotiation. But now what might I have done differently. One of the things that didn't get funded to the same extent by the U.S. After the 2013 elections was preparation for elections, because I guess like many people, people thought that not us in the embassy, but other people thought that, well, Honduras had gotten more or less back on track, and that we could take the same amount of money and put it into something else. We've put it into the Alliance for Prosperity, which has a big governance component to it, but not an elections component. So what do I think has to happen now? I think the U.S., I would call on my colleagues in the U.S. government to say, look, you know, the democracy in other countries actually affects U.S. interests directly, and there needs to be a little more emphasis on that. I wouldn't do it by cutting foreign assistance. Cutting foreign assistance means you can't do the programs that might help bring about change.
It's a lot here. So, okay.
Leave the hard ones for Carl.
Yeah, that's what I'm planning. Yeah. So look, I've been privileged as my colleague Dan Erickson has, to actually, with Vice President Biden, be an opportunity to actually interact a lot with President Hernandez. And I'll say, just speaking personally, that I have respect for President Hernandez. I know that makes me sound totally biased in his favor, but I think that in the conversations that we had with him in private, they were often very tough conversations about issues of human rights, about widespread corruption, where we went back and forth in ways that we would never do in public. The Vice President and him about issues that needed to move in a concrete way in order for the U.S. Congress to feel like Honduras had put some skin in the game. So the question is, should we have, in 2009, or even in the run-up to this election, been more vocal in our criticism publicly? I honestly don't think that would have had the desired response, given how polarized the politics are in Honduras. And so we felt we were much more effective in having the tough conversations in private. We found that everything that he, as a president, committed to do, for the most part, did. I think the actual cleaning out of the police force, some people have been saying, and I can't actually corroborate this, have been saying that the fact that some of the police was out and protesting, some people think that those individuals are the ones that were actually kicked out of the national police because of their ties to corruption. Can't speak to that, but I think it's worth actually looking into. And so you have to recognize that as president, he has made some really concrete moves in some areas, and other ones has come up significantly short. I would say in the area of matters of human rights, of actual consultation with communities when it comes to development projects. But that's, you know, when you get up every day, how much do you get through your to-do list? And I know I'm overly simplifying it, but I think the challenges in Honduras are beyond the scope of any particular president, no matter how much they want a certain outcome. Can Hernandez just power through and this goes away? Probably. But I think a lot of it will depend on how strong the response of the United States is, and how much we're actually working with the Organization of American States, and really under the auspices of the Organization of American States. But it's important, I think, separate the OAS electoral observation mission. I think a lot of people are very critical of the OAS and its mission and its role and how effective it is. One thing they do well is observe elections, right? They actually have a very good team that has been doing the work down there. Once they deliver a report, the decision by the Secretary General to call for a new election, that's a political decision. That's not the recommendation of the electoral observation mission. They are experts that provide a technical assessment. So is new elections the outcome? Is that where we end up? I think, realistically speaking, we will end up in a scenario, if I were to look in my crystal ball, and I don't think we'll actually arrive at elections, but there'll be some sort of middle ground. I don't know. The State Department may be actually working on this behind the scenes, along with members of the OAS, is how do you actually find a solution that satisfies the severe deficiencies in the Honduran electoral system so that this doesn't happen again? But I don't think you'll end up having some experts I've talked to said there's no legal framework for them to hold elections again or actually deal with this issue. And so how do you find an outcome that actually fits within the context of the Honduran legal system, I think is somewhat unclear. Now look, going back to, Jake, to your comments on just the role of the U.S., I think one of the first things that we did as a government after 2009 was call down to Southcom and say, do not say anything publicly. You have great relations with the Honduran military, but do not say a word. And then after that, the process was really managed primarily by the NSC. Dan Restrepo was a senior director at the time, and then the front office in the State Department, and that was Ambassador Kelly going back down and forth. So this was actually something that was managed by and large by the diplomats at the State Department in coordination with the White House. Sure, military contacts talked to each other, but when it came to actually deciding what the U.S. policy was going to be, it was the U.S. ambassador, it was the front office of the Bureau, and it was the NSC, not really OSD, not Joint Staff, not the kind of ties that existed between the military in Honduras and the military in the U.S. And yeah, the San Jose process was actually something that was explored when Honduras was kicked out of the OAS. Ultimately, the San Jose process broke down and they had to go back to the OAS to actually get to an electoral outcome. And that, I would say, continues to be the path, is that you have to work with the Organization of American States. Unfortunately, to Dan Erickson's question, the Electoral Observation Mission has come out with a report. The Secretary General has called for new elections. But on the political side, the OAS, as it currently functions, is not effective at exerting pressure on individual governments to do anything. So I think the question really is, how much is the United States going to push and how hard to get to a certain outcome? But they need to do it in a way that is in cooperation with the countries in the region, and is something that both parties, as Ambassador Kurbisky's mentioned, that both parties can actually agree to. And in this regard, I think Zelaya, I'm sorry, is not a dependable or rational actor, and I think he benefits from the current situation.
Carlos?
I agree on this last point. I mean, no, about former President Zelaya. The very small part of the conversation in Washington, D.C. that refers to Honduras is usually, even these days, scenified with two characters, which are Zelaya and President Hernandez, right? And this is more and more whether, I mean, yeah, this guy has problems, but what about this guy, right? And we are all forgetting in this conversation that we're talking about institutions, whether we like or not the guy. This is institutionality, and this is what has been perverted. So, yes, we thought that Honduras was coming back from the coup, but the institutionality was completely eroded. The military police is a good example, and since this was a couple of questions that were posed here, let me refer to that. Ambassador Kubitschek is right. The military police was not supported by the United States, and the money went to the police. That made a huge difference between the two forces. It did. Let's just remember that the National Police came from being a very corrupt body, and it was purged. And with assistance from the United States, it was reconstructed with a lot of emphasis in human rights. For some reason, the officers believed this. I'm telling you, you could notice it on the streets. You can notice it on the streets these days. I mean, the first person that died during the curfew, she died in the first minute of the curfew. She was shot by the military police in a bridge in Tegucigalpa. Why there were no more people killed in that bridge? Because the police crossed a car to block the military police from keep shooting at them. I spoke with a lot of policemen while being there, and there's a confrontation on the small level, on the street officers. They don't like the military police because they think that the military police is repressive, because they think that the military police has not been formed in human rights. And it comes to this point. During the curfew, no one could be on the streets except for government officials, diplomats, and journalists. So I went out. I found on some marginal neighborhoods that we went in that people were on the streets talking to policemen. As soon as military police entered the neighborhood, everybody went back to their houses, which speaks a bit about the relationship, because also this new police was created to have more communitary relationships more relationship with the community. Does it make it? I mean, I'm talking as if it was the best police in the world, and it's not. So, but it's much better than what Hondurans had. That's for granted. Now, someone asked if they were apolitical or what happened. Well, when the police chiefs refused to go out to the streets, some of them were sacked by President Hernandez, and then he raised the salaries of the rest of the policemen. So now they're back on the streets. They are still reluctant to go against the population, but I don't know how much this is going to last in the current scenario. This was good enough for the last days. But in these 2 days of confrontations, I think there's officers already being killed. I mean, the confrontations increased a lot since yesterday. So we don't know what's going to happen with that. But yes, I wanted to talk about the difference between the police and the military police. The military police is basically a presidential force. He is the chief of that force. You said something that reminded me of a conversation I had these days with an academic. We were talking about what's the solution for Honduras, and this person told me, don't we miss Jimmy Carter, right? You worked for the Carter Center, you said. I mean, because when the Carter Center went on and there was a conflict, you had a person with world stature that could bring these people together, sit them down and say, okay, let's talk. We don't have that right now. I mean, I don't mean when he was president, but with the Carter Center when he was overviewing elections. And he did this many times. We don't have a Jimmy Carter right now in Honduras. Yes, so maybe this is part of the problem or part of the lack of solution that we're finding right now. We don't have a high stature character that could sit these people down. You asked about the position of President Hernandez with irregularities. Well, he was silent at first, and then he said, okay, if they want a recount of the vote, let's have a recount of the vote. I mean, in that sense, he's been calling the right shots. It's just that the implementation of those shots has not been very transparent, to put it in a way. That's why not only the opposition, but also the Partido Liberal denied to be part of this recount because they thought it was not transparent. So that's the position so far. He gave a press conference today reaffirming that he had been re-elected. Eric, your question, which is very similar to what Peter asked, I have to put that answer on hold. I don't know how you can, I mean, what can change on the ground? Well, there's just a small piece of information that could add to think about possible solutions. Next year, you have critical elections in Venezuela, Bolivia, right? And it has been much easier until now when you have leftist governments trying to re-elect themselves through very abnormal ways. It has been easier for the United States to say this is not good. Right? It has been easier for the OAS. It has even been easier for Human Rights Watch, right? Today, it's like a proof, not a proof, but a trial. How do you say una prueba? A test. I'm sorry, my English is getting so rusty. It's a test for everybody. So far, the UAS passed the test, right? Because they know what's coming. They can't call this right and call tomorrow the other thing wrong. Just to add this piece of information, next year's election may affect this position. That's why the United States is in a much critical position than what probably they would like to be in at this moment. Because if you want to go around saying that you exercise your foreign policies based on principles, then you have to act based on principles, and principles are universal. I think that's the only thing I can answer to you, Peter.
Well, as Groucho Marx said, you know, if you don't like these principles, I have some others that. Anyway, this has been a great session. I want to thank all of you for coming. Carlos, Juan, Lisa, thank you so much. The dialogue continues on Honduras and other issues, and we'll be having more panels and sessions, and we hope to see you back at the dialogue. Happy holidays to everybody. Thank you for coming.